Daniel had worked as a civil engineer for 15 years, most of them on infrastructure projects that few people ever saw. His specialty was tunnel reinforcement, a quiet profession that kept him underground for weeks at a time, inspecting concrete pours and steel supports while the city moved on above him. He liked the solitude, the rhythm of hard hats and flashlights, the way a project could consume him completely. When the city awarded a contract to extend the old metro line, Daniel was hired to supervise the night shifts, a schedule that suited his preference for silence and shadows. The work was routine until the third week. Around 2 in the morning, a backhoe operator radioed him about an anomaly. At a depth of 12 meters, the drill had hit something that was not rock. Daniel descended into the excavation, the air thick with dust and the smell of wet earth. The crew had uncovered a concrete chamber, about 2 meters wide, sealed with a metal hatch that bore no markings, no date, no company logo, no warning signs. The concrete appeared decades old, far older than the existing metro line, its surface rougher, mixed with aggregate that hadn't been used in years. Curiosity turned to unease when they forced the hatch open. Inside was a metal suitcase, a handheld tape recorder, and a mobile phone so ancient it looked like a relic from another century. Daniel picked up the phone, its plastic casing cracked, the screen fogged. He felt the weight of something he could not name. He made a decision that would unravel his entire life. He reported the find to his supervisor, a man named Corley who had always seemed uninterested in anything beyond budgets and deadlines. Corley called someone from the city's infrastructure office, and within the hour 2 men in dark coats arrived at the site. They descended into the pit without helmets, their shoes sinking into the damp soil. They took the metal suitcase and the tape recorder without a word, handling them as if they were dangerous. When Daniel asked what was going on, one of the men told him to focus on his work. The other noticed the old phone in Daniel's hand and dismissed it with a wave, saying it was worthless and he could keep it. They left as quickly as they had come, their car disappearing into the night. The next morning, Daniel was summoned to the site office. Corley sat behind his desk with a letter already printed. Daniel's contract was terminated immediately for operational irregularities, a vague phrase that meant nothing and everything. No explanation, no appeal, no severance. By noon, his security pass was deactivated, and the night crew looked at him with a mixture of pity and suspicion. Confused and angry, he returned to his apartment, replaying every moment of the previous night. That evening, while he was making coffee, he heard the lock on his door click. He froze, his hand tightening around the mug. The door swung open, and 2 men in civilian clothes stepped in. They identified themselves as working for a private security firm contracted by the city, though they showed no badges. They asked where the mobile phone was. Daniel, heart pounding, said he had thrown it away. They searched his apartment for 20 minutes, overturning drawers, emptying his closet, checking the bathroom cabinet. Then they left with a warning: forget what he had seen, or there would be consequences. Daniel did not forget. After the men left, he waited an hour, then retrieved the old mobile phone from the false ceiling in his bathroom, the one place they had not checked. He sat on his bed in the dark, turning the device over in his hands. It was a model from the early 2000s, the kind with a small monochrome screen and a stubby antenna. The battery had long since died. He found an old charger in a box of tangled cables and adapters, plugged it in, and held his breath. Miraculously, after a few minutes, the screen flickered to life. The phone displayed a series of text messages, all from the same period, all addressed to a recipient identified only as receiver. The messages were not in plain language, they were strings of numbers and letters, clearly a code of coordinates, perhaps, or references to something Daniel could not yet understand. He scrolled through dozens of them, his heart racing. He understood that someone had gone to great lengths to hide these communications. He also understood that the men who had ransacked his apartment would be back. They knew where he lived. They knew his face. He packed a bag with clothes, his laptop, the phone, and some cash, then left that night, driving without direction until he found a budget motel on the outskirts of the city. He paid with cash and registered under a false name. He needed someone who could decipher the messages. For 2 days, he stayed in the motel room, curtains drawn, searching the internet for any mention of the old metro line construction. He found archived news articles from the 1990s about budget overruns and lawsuits that were quietly settled. He found a name, Emil Horvath, a retired civil engineer who had worked on the original metro line and had later been involved in a dispute over tunneling contracts. A blog post from a local history society mentioned that Horvath had disappeared from public life after his complaints were dismissed. Daniel tracked down an address in a suburban town 2 hours away, a place he had never heard of. He drove there the next morning, the old phone wrapped in a cloth in his glove compartment. The house was small, set back from the road, with overgrown weeds and a porch that sagged in the middle. An elderly man with weathered hands and tired eyes answered the door. Daniel explained who he was, what he had found, and why he was there. Horvath's expression shifted from suspicion to recognition to something deeper: fear, perhaps, or relief. He invited Daniel inside, closing all the curtains and checking the street through the slats. When Daniel showed him the phone, Horvath's hands trembled as he scrolled through the messages. Horvath told Daniel a story that had been buried for nearly 3 decades. In the 1990s, a powerful family, the Corbin Group, had won the contract to build the original metro line through bribes and manipulated bids. Horvath had been a junior engineer then, young and idealistic. He discovered that the family had diverted public funds by inflating material costs and using substandard concrete that would not last. When he tried to report it, his supervisor was fired, and he received death threats. He kept quiet to protect his wife and young daughter. But he had evidence. The phone belonged to a colleague named Julian, an older engineer who had compiled proof of the corruption before he vanished. Julian had given Horvath the phone and told him to keep it safe. The encrypted messages were coordinates, payment records, and names of officials who were bribed. Horvath had never been able to decode them fully because the cipher key was lost. He believed the key was in the metal suitcase that had been taken from the chamber. Without it, the messages were just numbers. He had lived with that weight for 30 years, watching the Corbin Group grow more powerful, buying security firms and cultivating politicians. Daniel asked why he had never spoken out. Horvath replied that without proof, he would have been destroyed. Daniel realized that the chamber had been sealed intentionally to hide the evidence. Someone, likely the Corbin Group, had discovered the cache years earlier but had been waiting for a pretext to retrieve it without attracting attention. Daniel's discovery had forced their hand. Now they had the suitcase, but they did not know the phone still existed. Horvath warned Daniel that the Corbin Group was more powerful than ever. They now owned a network of private security firms and had ties to city officials, police, and even the prosecutor's office. Daniel asked why Horvath had kept the phone all these years. The old man replied that he had hoped one day someone would come looking. He then revealed something he had kept hidden for decades: a notebook containing partial notes about the cipher, a series of engineering blueprints that held the key. The cipher was based on structural load calculations unique to the original tunnel design. Horvath had spent years trying to crack it without the full specifications. He had given up, but he had never thrown the notebook away. He handed it to Daniel, pages yellowed with age, filled with cramped handwriting and diagrams. Daniel felt the weight of it, the accumulated desperation of a man who had waited too long. Daniel spent the next 2 days in Horvath's house, working through the blueprints and the encrypted messages. Horvath explained that the code used a substitution cipher where numbers corresponded to specific pages and lines in the original tunnel specifications. But the specifications had been archived and sealed by the city years ago, locked away in a records department that no longer answered public requests. Without access to those documents, the messages would remain illegible. Daniel knew he could not request them officially without alerting the Corbin Group. He needed another way. Horvath mentioned a retired city archivist named Margaret Dunn, who had worked in the infrastructure department for 40 years. She was known to have kept personal copies of key documents after she was forced out during a restructuring. She was sharp, meticulous, and she hated the Corbin Group for what they had done to the city. She lived in a retirement home across the city. Daniel hesitated. Every step he took seemed to bring him closer to danger. But he had come too far to stop. He left that afternoon, the notebook tucked inside his jacket, the phone in his pocket, and a photograph of Horvath's family from the 1990s that the old man had given him as a reminder of what was at stake. Margaret Dunn was a sharp woman in her 80s, her hair white, her eyes still bright. She lived in a small room at a retirement home, surrounded by books and files. When Daniel showed her Horvath's notebook and explained what he had found, she grew quiet for a long time. She told him that she had always suspected corruption in the original Metro project but never had proof. She kept the archived specifications because she knew one day someone might need them. From a locked cabinet in her room, she retrieved a binder filled with faded pages, the exact tunnel specifications from 1994, complete with structural calculations, material lists, and inspection logs. She handed it to Daniel without hesitation. That night, in a motel room far from the city, Daniel spread the pages across the bed and began the painstaking work of decoding. The encrypted messages were strings of numbers. Using the specifications, he translated them one by one. The first revealed a name, a city official who was still in office. The second revealed a bank account in an offshore jurisdiction. The third revealed a date and an amount. By morning, he had decoded nearly a dozen messages. They painted a clear picture of systematic bribery spanning decades. Daniel knew he had enough to go to the federal authorities, but he also knew that the Corbin Group had infiltrated local law enforcement. Horvath advised him to contact a journalist instead, someone with a reputation for exposing corruption. Margaret gave him a name, Elena Vasquez, an investigative reporter who had won awards for her work on organized crime and government misconduct. Daniel called her from a payphone in a gas station, keeping the conversation brief and cryptic. Vasquez agreed to meet him in a public park the next afternoon. That night, Daniel stayed in a motel under a false name, the binder and phone never leaving his sight. He woke just after midnight to the sound of a car idling outside. Through a crack in the curtains, he saw two men in dark suits sitting in a black sedan. They had found him. His hands went cold. He slipped out through the back window, leaving his bag behind but taking the phone, the notebook, and the binder. He ran through a narrow alley and reached his car parked 2 blocks away. As he drove, he watched the rearview mirror, expecting headlights to appear at any moment. They did not. He reached the park an hour early, sitting on a bench with his back to the path, the binder hidden inside a canvas bag at his feet. Elena Vasquez arrived alone, wearing a plain jacket and carrying a small digital recorder. She sat beside him without introduction. Daniel laid out everything, the buried chamber, the phone, the cipher, the decoded names. Vasquez listened without interrupting, her expression shifting from skepticism to intensity. When he finished, she asked to see the phone. She scrolled through the messages, then through the decoded transcriptions. She recognized several of the names immediately. They were connected to corruption allegations that had never been proven because witnesses had disappeared or recanted. She told Daniel that the Corbin Group had tried to intimidate her before, sending men to follow her, threatening her sources. But she was not afraid. She proposed a plan. She would publish a story with the evidence, but first they needed to secure it in multiple locations to prevent it from being destroyed. Daniel agreed to give her copies of everything. As they parted, Vasquez warned him to disappear until the story ran. 3 days later, Vasquez published her investigation online. The article was long, meticulously sourced, and devastating. It detailed the decades-long corruption scheme, naming the Corbin Group executives, the city officials who took bribes, the bank accounts used to launder money, and the security firm that had tried to suppress the evidence. Within hours, the story went viral. News outlets across the country picked it up. Federal prosecutors announced they were opening a formal investigation. The city suspended several officials. Daniel watched from a motel room in a small town near the border, the television on low, his phone turned off. His hands shook as he saw his own name mentioned, not as a hero, but as the engineer who had found the truth. But the victory was not complete. The Corbin Group issued a statement denying everything, calling the evidence fabricated and Vasquez a sensationalist. Daniel knew that without the physical evidence, the phone and the original specifications, the case could still be challenged. Then, in a turn he did not expect, Emil Horvath emerged from hiding. Horvath contacted Vasquez directly. He was willing to testify publicly about what he had witnessed in the 1990s, the bribes, the threats, the disappearance of Julian. He also revealed that he had kept a second copy of the tunnel specifications in a safety deposit box, along with a sworn affidavit he had written decades earlier but never filed out of fear. The combination of Horvath's testimony, Daniel's phone, the archived documents from Margaret, and the affidavit created an undeniable chain of evidence. Federal agents raided the Corbin Group's headquarters, seizing computers, financial records, and the metal suitcase that had been taken from the chamber. Inside the suitcase, they found the cipher key that Horvath had believed was lost, a small notebook that matched the one Daniel had been given. Within a week, 3 executives were arrested, and the city official named in the messages resigned. Daniel returned to the city to find that his name had been cleared. The city offered him his job back, but he declined. He had seen enough of what lay beneath the surface. A month later, Daniel visited Emil Horvath at his home. The old man looked lighter, as if a weight had been lifted from his shoulders after 30 years. They sat on the porch, watching the afternoon light fade over the quiet street. Horvath said he had waited 3 decades for someone to finish what he started, and he had almost given up hope. Daniel replied that he had only done what was right, and that anyone in his place would have done the same. Horvath shook his head. He said that most people would have thrown the phone away, would have taken the warning and moved on. But Daniel had kept digging. Before leaving, Daniel handed Horvath the old mobile phone. It was, after all, the only thing left of Julian, the engineer who had first tried to expose the truth. Horvath held it for a long moment, turning it over in his hands, then placed it in a drawer. He said it belonged to the past now, and it was time to let it rest. Daniel drove back to the city that evening, the road stretching ahead under a darkening sky. He did not know what he would do next. Engineering felt different now, but he knew one thing for certain: he would never again ignore something buried just because it was easier to look away.